I'm going to spend about 1 hour lecturing, and then I'll try to stop pretty close to that, and we'll have time for questions about a half an hour. So prepare your questions. Maybe you can put them in the chat or do them orally when we're here. Anyway, not surprising, since one of our sponsors is the BCS Quality Group, where the subject today is quantifying quality, or quantifying qualities, we could say. And I'm going to teach the how of doing that. Here, by the way, is one of my first quantifying quality books, Software Metrics, from 1976. And then a somewhat later one, Principles of Software Engineering Management, 1988. So I've been on this trail a long time, and still a lot is needed. A lot of people do not quantify, do not want to quantify, do not know how to quantify. And so we're trying to dispel the lack of knowledge about how to quantify. Should you want these slides, you can get them quite easily, even right now in PDF format, by using this QRL or this link, and that'll be shown later too. If you want to argue with me, I love to discuss things with people. There's my email. Feel free. I'm retired, got plenty of time to argue with people and discuss. And here's a couple sites where various things about me and my literature will be found. Okay, so what do we mean by quantify? And let's take it in steps here. To specify is a process that says write down something like a requirement or a design or something like that. Now, quantification is when we put a number on it instead of just saying hi or something like that. Okay. Now, once we've quantified something, we can also estimate how it will be in the future. Yes. So specifying possible futures. And in the future, when we've got the system running, we can measure and see how we're doing and give feedback to a sprint or something like that. So the important thing is, many people, when I say quantification, they think I mean measurement, and I don't. These are two distinct things. If you think about the phrase, I want to go to the moon and back in 5 seconds, right? I quantified and I made myself clear, but there was no form of measurement or estimation in that process at all. In fact, unnecessary, since it's quite clear we needn't do that moon mission. I'm not going to get back and forth in the time duration. So quantification is difficult, but it's rewarding too, and that's why we take the trouble. And here's a lot of reasons why, and we'll be going through those directly and indirectly during the talk, but there's basically managing and succeeding in our projects is what we're talking about. A few days ago, I had a conversation with a man many of you would know, but I'll keep him reasonably anonymous. And he offered me his new book, Joy of Agile, which hasn't come out yet. And I read through the book and I noticed he didn't quantify a lot of stuff. But also noticed that we had conversations as far back as 2005 about metrics. So I said, what's going on here? And I asked him, and he basically said, I'm really scared of numbers because they can get misused. And that's reasonable. So I started writing a little booklet just for the fun of it, called Digiphobia. And I think I invented that term. The more well-known term, which I don't like, is arithmophobia. And maybe some of you suffer from it. Maybe that's why you're here, or maybe that's why you're not here. Who knows? But here's one page of the book. Of course, I have 10 principles of everything, and here are the principles of digiphobia. I like citing Mr. Musk. he's very clear about the fact that any numbers you come up with are always to some degree incorrect, never perfectly correct, and that the task is not to be correct, but to try to be less wrong. Very interesting concept here. So with the, I buy into that. With my quantifying qualities, I'm not trying to get it perfect, but I'm trying to be less wrong. So there's a few other principles about if you're afraid of numbers or afraid of the misuse of them. I agree with you. They are potentially dangerous. What I'm going to teach is how to use the numbers safely so that misuse can be detected and corrected. What's the definition of quality? Well, it's amazing how many people, when you drill down and listen to what they're saying, are just talking about bugs. That's it. You know, high quality, few bugs, low quality, many bugs. Sorry, but quality is much more than that. Here's a general definition from my competitive engineering book, which describes a language, which I'll be talking about this coming hour, called Planguage, planning language. And qualities are stakeholder values, and we're going to be talking about stakeholders later, that describe how well a system functions. Okay, so in very simple terms, you can think of these as the ities: reliability, availability, maintainability, security, safety, all these, let's call them ities. We know them well under that name. But whatever their name, they do, the definition is they are valued by stakeholders and they describe how well a system functions. Okay, so that's the formal definition. Now, what's quantifying quality got to do with Agile? A lot, because Agile, as it should be, would have a lot more numbers in them. And I've written a whole little booklet about that. And those who are particularly interested in Agile are welcome to a copy of the book and find out what I've been writing since 1976 about collecting numeric data at each sprint and getting feedback and learning. It's on page 214 of the Software Metrics book. So here's another booklet I'm going to give you called Quantier. What I often do is I find a sexy, jazzy title for a book, and if it's fun enough, I then write a book based on it. So I decided to Quantier, and Quantiering was kind of fun, and wrote a little book on it. And here it is. And this could be considered a textbook for what we are teaching during this hour. If you want to, get a thorough textbook, one you can freely share with your colleagues. You can steal ideas from it, put it into your slides, and pretend like they're your good ideas too. Very happy for you to do that. Here's sort of table of contents of the Quantier book, and I'm going to largely use that as the template for my slides here. I'm going to go through these subjects one by one as time permits. And let's see, definitely want Chris in. And let's see, okay. Here are just some very small little practical examples of what we mean. You might say this is the book in one page and the lecture in one page. We're going to defining a scale of measure. Well, it looks like that. And using domain knowledge. Aha, well, we're a council organization, so that's our domain area. And etc. So these are meant to be just little small examples of what we mean by the headlines. Okay, I'm going to move. The detail for everything is in the competitive engineering book. And again, if you go to the reference B1 at the very end of the slides, you can get a free digital copy of it. If you prefer paper, my publisher would be very glad to take your money. And okay, so here's even a greater simplification of quantiering. This quantify. I believe if you're serious, if you're doing serious work, You have no option and no excuses. And if you try to avoid it, you should just leave the IT business. You need to learn to quantify all critical stakeholder values. None should remain with very high safety or something silly like that. You need to put a number on absolutely all critical, meaning very important to get right, stakeholder. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to give you a free book on the subject, so there will be no doubt, but it means a lot more than user and customer. I can tell you that right away. And it even includes European Union laws for privacy, GDPR, after you've Brexited, interestingly enough. That's a stakeholder. Once we've quantified the goals, here's a scale of measure, here's a goal level. We need to go into design or architecture or strategic planning, and we need to find something to do that will move us from where we are, which is a status level on a scale of measure, to our goal level. That's where we want to be. Now, this subject is such a large subject that we're going to do a part 2 of this lecture, probably in January, to be announced. And you're all welcome to join me on that. If you're very curious and you can't wait, by reading the Quantifying book, you'd get the second half early, or you can study it early because it's in there. Why is quantification useful? Because a lot of people say, well, it's too difficult and there are problems and I'm not going to do it. And well, yeah, I mean, all of that is true, but if the usefulness outweighs the costs, then you might want to do it. So what are the useful areas that might be the value of quantification? And I've listed them here, whole lot of stuff, but basically better communication between everybody about the complex systems we are building. What are the barriers? What is it that stops people quantifying? And I believe most projects, most of you, do not quantify well at all. If some of you are wonderful exceptions, send me some information about what you're doing or your paper on the subject. I'd love to know. But what I find is, for example, in the whole agile area, for example, is people either don't do it at all, or they do it very badly. They say they're doing it, but I would have 12 reasons why this is not a good quantification. So it's all this stuff. Education helps, but it helps even more if the leader says, I want this to be quantified. I don't want any wishy-washy, fuzzy political promises. Okay. So, so there are, again, lots of good reasons why we're stopped here. But I think we have to, if we're serious about conquering complex systems and succeeding in our projects, then we have to do this. There is no option. It is a minimum necessary process. Now, how to quantify? Well, here's something simple, and I'm going to return to it. Let's say you're going to do privacy as a quality, and you don't know how to do it. Well, if you write privacy into a browser, you'll get a lot of stuff. But if you write the word metrics or measures just after it, you get a lot more relevant stuff. In this case, privacy or privacy metrics, 331 million. But in fact, on the first page, in the first few, you will normally find very good advice from people who have specialized in this. They're experts on privacy metrics, and you'd be wise to listen to that advice. What they will prove instantly is this can be quantified. It's been quantified. People do it. So stop denying it and get on with it. Okay. So where can we use this ability to quantier? And the answer is everywhere. Okay, here's just a big list of everything, but it's certainly not limited to requirements as it might seem after this lecture, which is focusing on requirements today, but it's in all forms of project management and communication And it's certainly applicable outside of software in systems engineering. And it's certainly applicable outside of systems engineering in, for example, political and government planning, National Health Service, and medical things and things like that. So you can literally use this everywhere. Okay. So the summary of all that is that when we quantify, instead of using a nice sounding word, when we say 99.5 instead of exceptionally high, we are clarifying. And you may have noticed we have a problem with communication about complex systems. And one of the big tricks of reducing the fog and fuzziness is to quantify, because a number is just 100 times sharper and clearer than anything like extremely good or very high or other political slogans. Okay. Now, the step one in how to quantify doesn't begin with a number, as you may have thought. It begins with a scale of measure. In other words, before I tell you that my car does 200, maybe I should tell you that I'm talking about kilometers per hour, not miles per hour. Is that a good idea? So we need to start with defining a scale of measure. And that is the definition we put our numbers on. We put numbers on the scale of measure. And now I'm going to go straight to the way I define scales of measure always these days is I don't just have a succession of words like success in doing stuff. I have a succession of what I call scale parameters. Building is a scale parameter, resilience is a scale parameter, etc. Now, what this is it's partly a definition of the UN poverty goal, okay? But in other words, UN poverty goal consists of information about building things, about resilience, about vulnerable, poor people. Think the news in Kherson in Ukraine today. Situations, think of Ukraine again. And the degree of shock, like earthquake, think Indonesia and things like that. So now, by the way, scales are definitions, and we could just write a series of words like, you know, poverty is how poor you are, or something like that in dollars. But I found it much more useful in complex systems to derive a first order of definition, these scale parameters, and then, as we shall see, further define them. Okay, so there's an awful lot of definition going on. This definition is also a form of decomposition, breaking the complex problem down to sprints and things like that. Minimum viable products. Getting some ideas here? Anyway, I'll move on. I'll show you more what I'm talking about here. Scales are reusable. We can reuse them in the same project. We can reuse them for different levels on the scales we wish to talk about in the project. We can reuse them in different projects, and they can be reused in totally different cultures and languages in different countries. So they're highly reusable, and it pays off to save them and reuse them. And when you find scales are very useful, share them and make sure your own staff reuses them, like a scale library for your corporation. Okay, now here's a scale for social inclusion. Okay, something we were planning on a BCS course, as I recall. And the numbers of people moved out of poverty from a borough. Okay, now you'll notice that in the square brackets, we have the following scale parameters: people, poverty, and borough, which is the top level definition of social inclusion. You know, which people are included, what kind of poverty status do they have, and where are they from? And here we take each of the scale parameters borough people poverty, and we further subdivide them. Camden, Westminster, Wandsworth, for example. Dot 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 means it could be all the councils in Britain or the world for that matter. People, we are primarily interested in employed and unemployed. There can be other types of people, but we haven't shown an interest in them here. And then poverty, well, they're on the streets, they're on food support, they've got really bad credit card debt they can't pay off, and they're far below average in income. And we got plenty of problems like that. So now I've taken the idea of the quality of maybe British social politics, and I've decomposed it into a number of qualities. One of them is called social inclusion. So this is itself a decomposition. And then I decompose again, say I'm interested in various kinds of people, and I want to define what people I'm interested in down here, and various kinds of poverty and various boroughs. And so I define this. I can even take the concept of unemployed and I can define it further as one who is permanently unemployed or partially unemployed during the year or whatever I want to do. We're not necessarily finished with definition. I'm a fanatic on defining things well so we communicate ideas very well. And this is one of my tools for doing that. Okay. Now, here symbolically is a scale. It's just this, by the way, is some functionality, the function of the system, like a banking system or a Camden Council system. And here is a scale of measure. And scales of measure go from, in theory, minus infinity to plus infinity with a zero in the middle. But we're usually not interested in infinities. Now, on this scale, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different points of interest. Okay, you can probably guess what a goal is, and maybe you can guess what a wish is, and maybe you can guess what status is, although I will define them more formally later for you. And in this particular case, with a click on the app right here, we can get detailed information of this status of 12 something or others on the scale, that the status is for all the people types, and the poverty types are the three. They're on the streets, food support, and below average income. So this is a set of definitions of the scale parameter. And the borough is Camden, and the date this status was recorded was that date in September. The level is 12, and the source is 2 of our BCS course participants, Jennifer and Shane. So we know who wrote it. Okay, so a major point from this diagram is that a scale can be reused as many times as is useful for many different purposes. Here we're recording analysis of where things have happened. Maybe how our project status is improving and increasing. The wish is the stakeholder desire, and the goal is the project commitment. We'll get back to those later. Okay, now, where do we get scales from? So here's a list, and I don't want to read through this and just say, there's a list. When you need ideas of how to get a scale, you can go to this checklist. But I've already hinted at it. Most scales are probably reused from some earlier part of this project or another project in your organization, or you found it on the web, or in this case, we have an app which stores definitions for flexibility and reliability and usability. And we just click on it and we automatically get the ready-made off-the-shelf scale, which we can modify if we don't like it for other purposes. In other words, scale should be stored in your electronic library and be modifiable. And that's how we do it. But there are lots of different ways of getting scales, and you probably haven't pre-stored all the interesting scales. Another way of getting scales is to, observe real life with your stakeholders. So here we have somebody being wheeled onto an ambulance, which I had the privilege of happening to me about 2 years ago. But that's another story. And but in other words, you have to know the domain. There are not standard scales for both banks and ambulances and city councils. You're going to have to tailor it to each of those domains. But if you start saying what kind of consumers in those domains are interesting and critical, you build up a list, and you can keep on gradually enhancing that list and then reusing a better and better set of consumers or scenarios or suppliers, etc. In other words, you build these scales with their scale parameters, and the scale parameter defined as this set of conditions. This is a set of conditions, okay? You do it by knowing your domain, talking with people from your domain if you're a systems analyst, and accumulating experience of what is worth working with, okay? Here's another one. A lot of you are probably interested in usability or user friendliness. And I keep on getting a little bit shocked at how few people who are interested in it do not quantify how user-friendly a system can be. We were doing this in the 1980s at ICL in practice. It's where some of these ideas were picked up from, by the way, like these here. I've just accumulated them and finally published them. But so here's usability. Now, what we found was usability was complex, and it consisted of a whole lot of different things, which are pretty readable, pretty intelligible. And then we can list each one of those things, like intuitiveness, and say, what is the scale of measure for intuitiveness? The probability that a defined user, scale parameter, can intuitively figure out how to do a defined task, scale parameter, correctly without any errors needing correction. Well, maybe you can use this pattern, if you like, or let's call it a scale pattern for the moment. A lot of people like patterns. Or template is another way of looking at it. And you can use it and maybe build your own set of ideas about usability that are relevant for you, and then tailor them even more by defining the types of users you're dealing with and the types of displays you're dealing with, etc. Okay. So next time you think about usability, go back to the slides, pick this up. It is, by the way, in chapter 5 of my book, Competitive Engineering, which you'll find you get a free digital copy of from these slides. Okay. Here's another one from the same book, page 156. We talk a lot these days about technical debt, bitterly regretting that nobody ever bothered to design or architect the system so it was easy to maintain, so that consequently the costs of maintenance are at least 10 times what they need be if we had only taken the time and trouble and money to engineer the system to be easy to maintain. So we all have huge technical debt on our older systems. In fact, the technical debt is so bad that we seriously consider throwing away the old system and buying a new $10 billion system that takes 10 years and fails to get on the air, as in health systems and stuff like that. Now, I copied from a book I found from 1966, not intended for IT or software people. I copied a pattern. The credit of the book is at the bottom there. So maintainability, in other words, ease of change or maintenance. And what I found was, again, it was a complex idea consisting of all these different things, and we could easily relate them to what we do in software. And then it wasn't too difficult. Problem recognition, how difficult is that? How much time until you recognize you got a problem? Duh. Okay. So, once you've got this pattern, it's not too difficult to most everybody to figure out a reasonable scale of measure. If you can't, they're written down here and they're in the book. Okay. One of my clients in 2003 did this to reduce their technical debt radically, and you'll find the case study there in the Green Week slides. So here from the same book is the basic pattern of quality, generic qualities, in the sense of they are found and they're interesting in almost all the systems we build. Okay, so here's the usability thing, not with 10, but only with 5, but the book contains many larger examples. And here's the maintainability one, which, as you saw, was further decomposed in the book to about 12 different things. So you could study that chapter in the book and, memorize it, because you can reuse this the rest of your professional life. So why not say, I'm going to spend an hour studying that so I at least know what's there. Let's see. Okay. Here's another point I want to make. As you see, even from the previous slides, a lot of names of qualities, like here's one called competencies from the World Economic Forum 21st Century Skills thing, okay, which I analyzed for a book on knowledge, in case anybody's interested. And here's the thing called competencies. Now, if you say, well, what are competencies? You can decompose it into these competencies: collaboration, communication, creativity, critical thinking, all of which we are very interested in our business these days. And then collaboration is essentially very different from creativity. So it's going to require a different scale of measure. Okay, so all these will use different scales of measure. And now, how do you sort of add up this set, which is called at a higher level competencies? Now, I actually have ways of adding them up, but I'm not going to reveal them. That's part 2. But the point is, competencies doesn't have really a measure unto itself, but it is measured by the set of these 4 ideas, which do have measures. So it's the idea I want to get across here is the idea that many qualities, if you decompose them first and consider this to be an umbrella title, then it becomes easier to think about how to quantify. I call this often Cartesian analysis for reasons that will be apparent if you look the term up. Okay. Now, here's an example of putting security metrics for telecom. So, metrics, you're going to get too many things. Security metrics, you're going to get a lot of stuff there, and we're all very interested in that area. Although I shockingly offered to teach a Swedish professor of security who did not deal with quantifying security, how to do it. And he simply said, I don't have time. I'm too busy holding classes and grading exams. I was shocked. But that's why we have to hold this lecture. Even professors of a specialist subject do not quantify their subject and don't seem to have the time to learn how to do it when offered to do it. Shocking. Okay. Anyway, here are some, 14 million hits, but the very first one is pretty darn good. Got some really good ideas for security metrics, and since we're in the telecoms business, we have a limitation of looking at things that telecoms businesses have thought were interested in security, because they have a different environment from, say, a bank or a council. Okay, so long story short, these are 2 different looks up. There's security metrics, and there's security metrics for telecoms down there. So putting in the right qualifiers, as usual, when browsing for things, is a very good practice. The moment you hear somebody saying this cannot be quantified, grab your phone and key in what they said couldn't be quantified with the word metrics after it, and wave the phone at them and say, there are 1 million hits on this, and the first 1 or 2 look pretty good to me. So I don't know what you're talking about when you say they cannot be quantified. That's the quickest way of getting the than the people in denial to wake up and realize they're going to look pretty foolish when they say it cannot be done, when maybe 1,000 people have done it pretty well. So here's just another one, prison instead of telecom security metrics. And then it's amazing, 3.7 million. But of course, prisons have to be secure too. Now, most people, when they show me their requirements or even their user stories, which pass as requirements, show me a sentence. And the sentence could be a user story sentence, or it could be a sentence like, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out, if you say, do you have anything more detailed? Every word in that sentence, more, balanced, right, self-government, autonomy, they're all ambiguous. So I can have fun guessing. I can make my own private guess, but maybe we need to agree on the meaning of these words before we have a 10 billion pound project for 10 years based on it. That's ridiculous. And what I've learned to do, and I mean, initially I'm tempted to take the ambition level, which I call it, or the user story, and throw it back at people and said, you have got to be kidding. Only children or uneducated people would offer this as a serious requirement. It is, every word in the 10 words is highly ambiguous. We've got to do something about it. And by the way, I'm working with UK government projects right now that seriously suffer from that fault, and they're thinking of spending their 8 billion pounds. Okay, no more said, but I think this is probably true of every large IT project, because our culture for good, clear numeric requirements and quality requirements is really atrociously bad. Okay, but people are waking up, and top managers are waking up, and things are happening. So you lot, my BCS friends, I hope you'll wake up before some manager tells you you're highly ambiguous. What kind of education did you get? Did you say you got trained at BCS with such bad methods? Okay, so what I do is I said I'm tempted to throw them back, but I've learned something. These often come from positions of power, like a government directive, the CEO. And you don't really want to insult those people directly to their face or in public. You might not be able to feed your family a month afterwards. So being diplomatically smart, what we do is we write it down and we call it the ambition level, or maybe the user story. We write it down. We use a little source arrow saying the source of this is this stuff, which happens to be the European Union bad specifications. Good thing we did Brexit. We got away from the bad specifications of the European Union, or did we? Anyway, and we write it down. We credit the sinners with their sins, and we pat them on the back and say, thank you very much for your insightful sense of direction of what we have to do in this gigantic health project or whatever it is. And then we say, in fact, we don't tell anybody. We start working with scales of measure and other things, because it is our technical duty as IT software engineers to quantify and clarify this management bullshit so that we don't waste the taxpayers' money time and time and time again on the wrong stuff. Okay, and we don't ask permission to do it. We say, because we are trained by BCS to be professionals, we know that it is our duty to take this highly ambiguous stuff in requirements process and do something with it, like make it intelligible and make it so we can think about it clearly, discuss it clearly, and measure it clearly. So you just do it. Now, if you've done it well, it should be readable enough that if you have to go back to the chief technical officer and discuss this, this is almost readable if you read it slowly and explain it a little bit. And you can give them a choice at that point. Do you want this clear, well-defined stuff, or should we delete that and go back and we'll put your name on this fuzzy stuff. And when the project goes wrong, of course, you'll have to get the blame or something like that. This is called begging the question, I think. Okay. Now, here's a little diagram. On the right-hand side of the diagram, the yellow arrows, they are various COVID values from stakeholders, like stay healthy, okay, get good research information, safety of passengers in trains. This was done a week before COVID hit fully, but we knew it was coming. And we have here, these lines, green lines here, they are connecting to the stakeholders for COVID, for the government of Norway in this particular case. Okay. And these are digitally linked, so the drawing is done automatically. But it gets interesting. For example, this stakeholder, emergency response services, is not connected to any value. Now, do they have any values? Well, you bet they do. Are they critical? What's his emergency response services? That's maybe like saving my life. I hope like getting quickly to pick up Tom and take him to the hospital if he's dying of COVID would be something they're interested in. So you can, in a very simple way, analyze which of our critical stakeholders have no values whatsoever, because by definition, a critical stakeholder has a critical value. Okay. And then we can go to a critical value, like in this case, the equipment capacity, and no, it's an orphan. No stakeholders interested in that. Well, one possibility is no stakeholders interested, and it's not interesting, and maybe we shouldn't use time and energy on it. Another is there is a stakeholder and they're here, but we just haven't identified it. And the third is there's a new stakeholder we haven't even thought about, like who is the stakeholder for equipment capacity, like the IT chief. Well, they're not here anywhere. Gee, maybe the IT people should be here somewhere. And they're interested in the capacity of their computers for handling COVID. Okay, so the main point of this is that our quantified objectives come from stakeholders and what the stakeholders need and want. And we need to keep track of that very systematically, and I believe digitally. And we need to do reviews and analysis and quality control of the type, why does this stakeholder have nothing? Why does this stakeholder value, even if it's quantified, have no stakeholder? Okay, now one stakeholder can hold many stakes, as you might have noticed on the chart there. But we do need to start with our most critical stakeholders. Even though we've identified 50, what's the number one most critical one to satisfy in the short term? And then say, what are their critical values? 1, 2, 3, 4. And now this is how we position ourselves for early agile sprints, because the early sprints need to deliver value to the most critical stakeholders for their most critical values at the most critical levels that have to be done in the short term. So this is how we plan what is our first sprint going to be. But we have to definitely establish the most critical stakeholder, or 2 or 3, and their most critical needs, and then the most critical goals, which are usually short-term goals for like the poorest people in the council and things like that. So, but we now here's the scale we've talked about before. You all know what these are, and here then is a stakeholder wish. So wish is formally defined as the need, the benefit that the stakeholder's looking for. Maybe it's so optimistic, so idealistic, it cannot be delivered at all, ever, technically, or within the budget, or within the deadline. So it remains a wish. I have a dream, said Martin Luther King. And look at the news, we're still waiting for it. Okay. But when we change the wish to goal, it means our architect has found existing technology or strategies that are within budget and within time frame, etc. And we can guarantee that our project will be able to deliver it. Okay, more about that later. So here's another picture like the one we showed before, but it's a little bit simplified because it's got all the stakeholders for just one particular goal. So in order to fully understand this goal and how to do with it, we're going to have to analyze, this is systems analysis, each and every one of these stakeholders and which components of the scale, which conditions they are interested in, especially the critical ones. So I'm mapping out a new agenda for business analysts, in case you didn't know, because they're very bad at analyzing stakeholders at all. But if they get into that mode, they're not just to identify a stakeholder, but they have to identify the critical values, and then they have to identify the critical conditions, like the poorest people during an earthquake kind of conditions that have to be dealt with. And that's, if you like, newfound systems analysis. And would the BCS please update their business analysis courses with this material? Okay, so basically, I get a lot of my scale ideas by just keeping my mind open, talking to the right people, reading stuff, finding stuff on the web, and getting a damn good first draft, which I then clarify with the powers that be, that they like it and they'll buy into it and deal with it. So as I said, sources of scales are stakeholders. And just for fun, here's a little stakeholders in a nutshell, 10 principles of stakeholders. But and here is a cycle of development where we can start with the stakeholders, we find their values. From the values, we do our architecture strategies, find solutions. We decompose them because we're agile. We develop the early agile sprints, deliver them in a sprint cycle, measure the feedback because we're numeric now. We want to see if we got the values we thought we'd get from the solution. And then we learn that we didn't get the value we thought we'd get from the solution. So maybe we have to go back and reevaluate everything. Like our values may be set unreasonably high and impossible, or our solutions may be not good enough ones, and we have to get our architects to get themselves enlightened. Anyway, without going into detail on stakeholder principles, there's a whole book on it I wrote that I'm offering a free copy of. But to make a long story short, stakeholders are very many. This idea of the customer and the user, or even the word user, as in user stories, and is childish. And let's put it this way: it's not childish. It is simple enough for extremely simple, small, short-term systems. Okay. But you're not here because you have a system that you can hack in a week and make happen. You're here because you're maybe working on the national health system in Britain, and it's a horrendously large, complex system which we do not master, and you need better technology to master it. So does the whole national health system does. And so you have many stakeholders, and they're very tricky. They don't want to admit what they want. They don't want to talk to you. They don't want to tell you. They don't quite know what they should want. And they're a bit confusing because they keep on spouting all these, ambiguous things. So here's the book. If you really want to go deep into this and maybe upgrade your agenda for systems analysis or business analysis, there's the stakeholder engineering book. You're very welcome to steal material from that with slight credit somewhere in the references. So again, here's another simple example, an ambition level, more balanced right of self-government, autonomy, and freedom. Boy, that sounds good. And that's a real one from, I think, the World Economic Forum stuff. Here are the stakeholders. And here's the scale, percentage of stakeholders who feel they clearly have certain rights to do educational activities. So you'll find that in my book called Ken, in reference B11, if you're very interested in knowledge and teaching and schools and things like that. Here's another example. So here we have a scale. This is from the United Nations Sustainability thing. By the way, I have a whole booklet I'll share with anybody for free called Sustainability Planning, and it goes into great detail like this, using the United Nations goals, and then it shows that they are highly ambiguous, bad goals, and they need to be structured and quantified like this. Okay, so last night I got a hold of a book, started reading by a professor at University College London, Mariana, and it's called something like Capitalist Mission or something like that. We'll dig it out, but it's a fascinating book. She is very clear about the fact that we need to quantify far more than we are quantifying of the goals for projects like, she specifically names the United Nations Sustainability Planning thing. So I wrote her an email about 5 o'clock in the morning saying, I'll be very happy to help you, Mariana, if you want help to do what you said, which is do better metrics on a broader front like this. So I'm waiting for an answer. If anybody here knows Mariana and wants to help me get in contact with her, please say hello. She's back from work on the 28th. Again, this is what the UN says, and they mention shocks and environment and stuff like that, but this is how I've structured it. I know I have to have some shocks things, and I know the shocks are climate, economic, social, and environmental. I also, second level of decomposition here, know that environmental is earthquake, flood, avalanche, and fire. You can keep on decomposing until no further decomposition is necessary. Oops. Okay, now I've got 5 minutes more on my agenda. I have I could probably use, and I have actually done it, 3 hours on this, but I've gotten my main points across. So I'll skim a little bit the last few slides and some highlights, and I won't try to go into depth. Here's a nice little diagram of this UN goal with its high level, which I just showed you in detail. Its high level scale parameters, its conditions, and even the environmental conditions with its sub conditions. It's a way of graphically understanding. So notice this is not about quantification. This is about structuring and defining the scale that we put numbers on. Okay, so the numbers are given additional meaning. And what we do in practice when we say, let's set a goal, we say, what's the most critical building idea or communications ability? What's the most critical resilience idea? By the way, I just participated in a BCS activity with Jill Ringland on resilience. And let's just say it's recovering from the problem there. They have a communications ability problem in Ukraine, and Elon Musk is helping them out with his satellite dishes. Vulnerable. What's the most critical there? And let's just say insufficient electricity services in Ukraine. Okay, well, what's the situation here? Family poverty. Okay, and what's the most critical shock thing? Gee, war isn't there. We need to improve our model and put war in there, because that's what's happening in Ukraine. It's not a damned earthquake, it's not a climate problem they have. So where our model isn't reflecting, and by the way, this method I'm teaching you is a way of modeling complex systems. And I have papers on that if somebody's very interested in modeling in itself, just ask me. Yeah, so what we're doing is we're actually taking a slice of the action, these scale parameters and conditions, and that slice becomes, in agile terms, our minimum viable sprint. Okay. Okay, here with a little bit more detail is that scale we've been talking about, which we've derived from this ambition level. Okay, the word resilience here becomes a scale parameter there. It's defined in detail, we showed you above. And then here in the status level, the resilience is escaping. That's most critical. Okay, that's a way of choose. When we select these things here, we are essentially choosing the most critical slice to deliver early. So we get high value in early agile increments, which is the point of agile, has always been. But a lot of people talk about it, but they don't do it, and they don't know how to do it. And this is one way to do it. If you know any better way, talk to me. Okay, let's see. I think I can, here, this is a diagram from the competitive engineering book, which goes into detail, but these are different types of scales of measure. I've talked about the wish and I've talked about the goal, but I haven't talked about a lot of the other ones, but they're well worth studying and going into more detail. They become ways of expressing what does this number mean, really? You know, I mean, so there's a difference between the state-of-the-art record and a stretch level you're dreaming about in your particular project. And this is the section that I haven't allocated myself enough time to, but where we go through these different ideas in some detail. Here's some of the work we did in the 80s at ICL teaching these ideas. I'm proud to report that with the support of Rob Wilmot, who understood everything I said very well and imposed it upon his reluctant directors, ICL, which had been in losing money for 7 years, went into profit for the next 15 years. And I like to think partly as a result of Rob Wilmot making sure these ideas of quality quantification were in fact used. Some of you listening there might have been a victim of that and even recognize this booklet, which I helped write. So enough of that. That was the end of my timing, and lots of stuff here, but detailed, and that's good enough for the 1 hour. End of part 1. Now, here again is another chance to, yes.
Hi, Tom. Can we go for another 10 minutes, please?
Well, I in a way, I don't want to do the lectures for more than 10 minutes, but I want to open up for questions and discussions. Okay, I know I could do it, but I think people have enough and they know where the stuff is. So if you don't force me to lecture on the last 10 slides, which I will if you say, do it, Tom. I think we go for questions was the idea. Okay? Or what? I'll take your advice. You're my host.
I think, I mean, just to finish a little bit more.
Okay, little bit more. We'll do that then. Let's see. Okay. So this last part was really all about, and by the way, now's a good time to put your questions in the chat, okay, while I'm talking. And so for each scale of measure, there's not just one idea like what's the goal. There are many ideas of different classes of numbers that can be on that scale of measure. In fact, in a lot of cases where people are doing like critical success factors, to take an example, they often limit themselves to one number, sort of the goal. And I believe that not only there probably should be many different goals, like short-term goals, medium-term goals, and long-term goals, and goals for critical things and goals for less critical things. So there should be many goals, but there should also be other things than goals. And so here they are. So here's the teaser. We just set a goal and we're done. And I say, no, there's all this other stuff that will help you manage your numbers and manage your projects better. For example, the pass level is simply systems analysis of your older systems, your current systems, and your competitors' systems, right? And so this is where the business analyst comes in. And in the requirement specification, they specify interesting past levels, good and bad. Okay, this is just informing people the background, it's called a background specification for the goals we're going to set. And you can compare the goals you set against past experiences. Now, status is sort of past, but actually it's a running real-time number. And it says, as we deliver these different increments, things are getting better and better and better and better. And the status of the last sprint was 33. And our goal is 50, so we're not there yet. Okay, so status is literally drawing a curve of experience in your project. Okay, keeping track of where you are compared to your goal. A trend is looking out past and status are looking out the back window of your car, but trend is looking forward. And people like marketing people understand and do trend analysis. But it's say in 1 year, how bad will our technical debt be if we don't do something about it now? And in 1 year, how good will our competitors' user friendliness be compared to us if we don't do something to fight that right now? So trend is systems analysis. And maybe the people you're going to ask for and get to participate here are marketing people or somebody that is looking, how are we going to compete on the market? Or how are we going to avoid our system getting degraded in time? And that forces us to think and forces us to set goals with respect to. For example, if your competitor is going to be at a great number in 1 year's time, then you can't set a goal that's worse than that and expect to compete with them. You're a loser and you have a loser project, okay? There's a reason why my book is called Competitive Engineering, and these are some of the reasons. We take a look at the competition, okay? I did comment on this. I held a lecture, and here's the reference to it, S12, of how we changed ICL and went into profit. So that's a British 26,000 person company at the time. And it was pretty hopeless before I got a top manager who would listen to my ideas. Margaret Thatcher put him in, and his name was Rob Wilmot, bless his soul. Here's another top manager who made things happen called John F. Kennedy. Okay, now the record, think Guinness World Records. So the record is a number which is the state of the art, the best ever done. So I looked up the pole vault record for men in 2020, and it was 6.17 meters. So if I told you that I'm planning next year, Tom Gilb, to jump 6.5 meters, you know I'm either fooling myself or I'm joking or I'm stupid. It's not going to happen, right? No way. And even the world record isn't going to move to 6.5. I will predict. Mark my words. Check me at the end of this year. Okay. Now, knowing the record, here's another way of thinking about it. Experts know the records. Non-experts are not even curious about the record. They don't know what it is. They don't care. And they declare themselves to be, for example, a security expert. Ask your security experts, what is the record for detecting hackers in this situation? What's the best ever done? And by the way, second question is, and what technology did they use at what cost? Oh, 70 billion quid. I don't think our Camden Council project can afford that. So what's the record that's been set for 10,000 quid security? Okay, very interesting stuff to ask what the record is. And by the way, if people who are supposed to be experts cannot answer that question immediately, I would suggest you should make a mental note. They are not experts and you probably should be very cautious in listening to their advice. Now, tolerable. Now, there's a whole lot of, I call this a constraint, and we have several constraints, but tolerable we use for the most part. Tolerable is the worst acceptable case, the minimum you can have before going operational. Although, of course, in operation, you'll work towards the better level of the goal. Okay. So, and it's very, very important to define these minimums and get agreement, political agreement, practical agreement, legal agreement, that we have to have these minimum numeric levels. And you can't have a minimum level that says not too bad, or it's just tolerably good security. You really have to put a number on it, and you really have to engineer it and architect it, and you really have to measure you there before you release your sprint to operation in your DevOps. Pause for thought there, right? Okay. So here's a little area where I have a level called OK, which is good. I have a level called the goal level, which is formally defined as success, and have a level my Finnish friends at Nokia coined for me called stretch, which is incredible. And then that's when you land two of your rockets simultaneously without them falling over. And that's incredible. And then but below OK are tolerable levels. You're alive, but it's uncomfortable, but it is a degree of failure. You just, here's success. Okay, well, I believe it's necessary to define failure quantitatively and get political and legal contractual agreement on it. Like the contractor doesn't get paid if they're in this area, no matter if you didn't find any bugs or not. Okay. And then below tolerable, you have a level which you can call catastrophically bad. Nobody wants to go near it, and you're dead. Okay, and that makes you think about your systems. Okay, so here are examples of fail levels, for example, which is a constraint. And then let's see, did use 10 minutes, not too bad here. Now, there's the wish level. I've talked about it before. That is formally defined as a wish due to a particular stakeholder. And that's the level the stakeholder wishes. Now, and so your business analyst has figured that out, documented it, double-checked it with the other stakeholders who were interested in this. They might have different wishes. And then finally, we've settled on it. Now, this then has to go to the systems architect or the strategic planner. Whoever is planning the stuff to do to get to these levels. And if you're very interested in architecture, I suggest my book, Systems Enterprise Architecture. You'll find free copies of it, I hope, back in the references in the slides. But so that architect or strategic planner has to find something you can do, which will get you to at least this level at a price you can afford. If they cannot, if the best they can find gets you to 60, then you don't have good enough architecture, and you either have to decline the option of delivering that wish, and you certainly can't deliver a wish of 70, or you have to get yourself a better architect who can find smarter, more effectful things or something like that, okay? But so the wish has to land in the laps of the systems architect, and they have to find a feasible. That means feasible means it's defined very formally in Planguage as what you have to do to be at a goal level, but it has to give the effects you want simultaneously with you giving all the other effects you want to give simultaneously, like in the same year. And within the resources that in fact are available for your stuff and everybody else's stuff at the same time within the same budget. That's pretty tricky stuff, and we'll be talking more about it in part 2 of how we manage that. But it all starts by having a clear idea of the stakeholders' wish. We have not yet granted their wish and put in a goal. Goal means, quite simply, the project believes they can promise to deliver this. So there's the goal there. It's we promise we can deliver it. Stretch is you're dreaming, but we've actually got some more budget and time, and we're going to try to see if we can go beyond satisfactory, successful goals and be even more competitive than we thought we had time and money for doing. And budget should be obvious for all the different costs. Here, the costs down here. So here's a bunch of values, and here's a bunch of costs in connection with the knowledge analysis, the Ken book. And I think I've used up my 10 minutes, so I'll leave you to read about landing zones, which my friends at Intel, who are big 20,000 engineers for 20 years, have used these methods to successfully on all the Intel products. And here's the leader of the pack, Eric Simmons, who invented a thing called landing zones, which they felt they needed, which is really not just a precise number, but an area they want to land their little helicopter in, which is good thinking. Okay, now I finished, and now we have 16 minutes, I believe, and now questions if you like.
Okay, we've got several questions. So here, was you going to do it or should I do it?
Please do it.
Okay, the first question is from Mike. How would Deming's operational definitions help with what you've spoken about?
A lot. By the way, I'm a student of Deming from London, 1984. I've got my certificate up on the wall back here, 1-week course. Long story short, Deming was a very strong believer in dynamically mastering anything with multiple quantified things. And his measuring process was his preference, because he was a statistician, was statistical process control. But the short answer is Deming and this fit fine.
Michael has a comment. Can I suggest under shocks, you could add conflict, war, ethnic, religious, civil unrest, local conflict, etc.?
Yes, thank you. Now, remember, what I was doing there was a draft for just showing that they could do better. So I wasn't trying to be complete. And if I ever get anybody like Mariana to take me up on this, I will have to work with the relevant people doing their sustainability planning for UN, which could be the Norwegian government, for example. And we have to work with and what they're interested in, what they're willing to work with. And so yes, as I said with the war example, things should be added. It should be as complete as possible. But if you're in a certain domain like Camden Council, there are certain things you really don't have to worry too much about for the moment. I hope, it's 70 years since we had to worry about V1 and V2 bombs from Germany over Camden. So, but they've got other things on their mind like COVID and poverty right now. The selection of what you do is the critical things you need to do for purpose and the things you're legally and morally obliged to plan for. And maybe Camden should plan for war, but it's a sad thought. Thank you. Again, my main answer is we have to do this in the real situation. And UN sustainability planning is not just the UN plans it. They've really got a framework for doing it, but there are thousands of different agencies and groups and companies all doing their bit here. And so one of them we worked with was an electricity company in Britain, which has adopted this, and they have to plan for being an electricity company in Britain. And that probably includes, as we learned in Ukraine, getting Soviet missiles over the electricity plant.
Okay,
Next
great. Yes, it's from Joseph. How does this differ from Duran's measurements?
Didn't I sort of just get that question? The answer is he said Duran.
Duran,
I'm mixing Duran and Deming. I've met them both. They're both there. They used to study together under Walter Schubert, so they were. But anyway, Yeah, Duran. Okay. Yeah, well, Duran wrote a great book I have a copy of called Quality Control Handbook, which is as cheap as because it's high volume, it's a very cheap book. And so there's massive stuff in there about measurement. I would say it is compatible with Duran's methods as in his Quality Control Handbook, which I have read large parts of. It's only about 7 inches thick. So there's no conflict whatsoever. If the implication was there was some kind of possible conflict, these are real engineers talking about using quality control engineering, and they're always talking about numeric quality control engineering.
Okay, great. We've got a comment from John, and he says his paraphrase is, requirements must always be accompanied by acceptance criteria, and the acceptance criteria must be quantified. So that's just a comment for him.
Yes. Well, yes and no. Let me start with a nice yes. Of course, if you decide that you're going to go for it, you're going to go for the goal, you will have to find, and that means you're going to incrementally probably deliver some of the value, maybe in 5 increments or 20 increments. And of course, you have to have a way of testing or measuring. Now, in Planguage, we have a parameter that I have not talked about at all in this lecture. It's called meter or test. And that is where you specify how you plan to get feedback, for example, during a sprint or with massive handover of the whole system to the world market, which are quite different tests. So yes, of course, test planning where appropriate. Now, if you discover through the use of these methods that the wish, it cannot be granted, it's out of scope technically and economically, then there is no reason whatsoever to specify a test or a measure for something that will never be implemented and logically will never be able to be tested. So in other words, it doesn't always follow because you're quantifying these things. That was the example I gave about, I want to go to the moon in 5 seconds. If I cannot do that, nobody has to sit around with a stopwatch figuring out if I got there and back in 5 seconds. It ain't going to happen. So there's a quantification has a use independent of and beyond the idea of measurement. And I tried to make that point earlier, but maybe this question was asked earlier or the person didn't get my point yet. And I hope he got it now.
Great. Okay, the next question is from Christopher. How would you argue the case to define stakeholders and quantify in a project where the counter argument is that there isn't time to do that now?
Okay, yeah. I take it he means there isn't time to define stakeholders and isn't time to quantify.
Yeah, right now, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, Christopher, I refer you to my papers, which hopefully are in the back or reference. If not, I will send them by email to you on what I call my planning week. Now, what I do in a planning week is and I've done this for extremely large projects. The case study example is US Department of Defense Army. Monday, we have a group or committee that identifies the top 10 most critical values. And they did that. And on the same day, in the afternoon, they defined scales of measure and reasonable numbers on the scale. And we're all done on Monday. Okay? Now, you can always refine this by further study, but these particular people had worked on this project for the existing system for 8 years. And so they knew their stakeholders and they were a reasonable representation. They don't pretend to know everything that everybody knows, but they knew enough to identify the critical stakeholders, like the general of the war in Iraq at the time, and who had said that their system was a bad system. So they knew, what was it, General Schwarzkopf was in fact their #1 stakeholder because he had complained about their system during the Iraqi war as being a crap system. Okay, so they were pretty clear about that. And what they did is they managed to quantify the goals as I'm telling you on the first day. The second day was used for finding strategies, the top 10. The third day was used for numeric analysis, my part 2 of this lecture, of the strategies against the goals numerically, 1 day. And the fourth day was used for decomposition. So they had something to do next week to begin delivering the value next week and every week thereafter. Okay. The general in charge of all this, Brigadier General, said and gave me a diploma, which I possess and can give you a copy of. This is, he said, I went to West Point to learn planning, but this is the best fucking method I have ever seen in my life, and everybody's going to do it. And the general ordered them to do it. So in other words, if I can do that for a very large system sufficiently for purpose in 1 day, what's your problem with time? Okay, I'm not saying you have to analyze every stakeholder in depth, a week's study of 50 stakeholders. I'm saying you have to do well enough to get rolling with your initial agile sprints, and then you can, in parallel, your business analysts can, in parallel, analyze more and more stakeholders and more values and more quantification in parallel, but you're still going to start delivering the most critical thing you can think of next week. And that's how my methods operate in practice for decades all over the world.
Okay, the next question is from David. Would you accept multiple requirements leading to a single measurable goal, or would you always break them down to a single serial cause and effect for each requirement?
Yeah. Now, the single measurable goal, in simple answer is no, I don't do that and I avoid it. If I've got 10 critical requirements, I need to know that the set of 10 is achieved or not. That's the definition of done. If you have 10 critical requirements with 10 critical goals, and you're at a state where all 10 critical goals are reached, you're done, you're successful, and it's the set of 10 that tell you. Now, you could say, I have I shout, hey, we're done. That's my single measurable goal, that we can shout, hey, we're done. Okay, but I do not add them up. You can do that. There are ways of doing it, but I like to declare victory for the top 10 critical goals and put them on a page or a slide and say, we've achieved the security goal, we've achieved the user friendliness goal, we've achieved the competition adaptability goal, and you can put that all on one page. You don't need to oversimplify by numerically adding them up, which is pretty tricky since they have different scales of measure, but not totally impossible. But the moment you add them up, you're hiding the useful detail of how well we did in security and how well we did in usability. So I just don't do that, and I don't recommend it, David.
Okay, the next one's from Keith, and it's a little bit long.
I've got it in front of me, of course.
Okay, yeah. It was interesting, the point about the term user or maybe operator. Wouldn't it be applicable to systems that could be incredibly complex, but have a small, e.g. no more than 10 throughout a lifetime of 20 years, and technically specialist user base, as opposed to systems that could have thousands of users with a large range of technical abilities?
Oh, good. I have a little game I play when I'm teaching people on my BCS courses. Go back and rephrase it in 10 words or less, literally. But I won't impose that upon Keith just now. Let's see, what the heck is he saying? The user term. Now, number one, when I say user and use it, I'm well aware that there are very many different types and classes of users. And you'll see that in my usability definition that I've referred to in chapter 5 of the competitive engineering book, that we have scale parameters for different classes of users. Okay, so there are always many different types of users. It's not a singular thing, except as a broad simplification. My problem with user is that people say user, but they don't say stakeholder. And it turns out there are 50 stakeholders, of which user is maybe only one. So you're missing 49 stakeholders like legal requirements in Europe for GDPR, which is not a user, but it sure as hell is an important stakeholder because your system is not allowed to legally operate in Europe without it. Is that sort of an answer? By the way, we should stop talking about user stories. We should talk about stakeholder stories. First person who does it, tell me about it, show me. We need to have not UX for user experience, but stakeholder experience. We need to broaden this to systems engineering. The user term is out of date by about 3 decades. It's important, but it's not the only important thing we have to look at in IT.
Okay, we've got time to squeeze in one more question, I think. This is from Martin. My organization is quite immature in measurements within projects, sprints, etc., and is now mandating that OKRs are defined on every project. Does what you've talked about today fit with OKRs, or should we be looking to do things differently?
Okay. Now, with a bit of luck in the references at the end of the slides, you will find a paper called What is Wrong with OKR? You will also find it in the Value Agile book. I gave the linkage to that in earlier slides. Now, long story short, I think OKRs are wonderful for their intended purpose, which was originally to let one individual plan their work about 2 weeks ahead. If you, so my paper on what's wrong with OKRs has about 10 points, pointing out why they're too simple for being suited to serious projects like the National Health System or the United States Army system. Okay, in other words, what we're looking at something as simple as a user story, which is also not suited for large-scale serious systems. Okay, so long story short, I don't like OKRs for serious purposes. I do not recommend them, and I extensively criticize them in writing in the Value Agile book, in the OKR paper book. And if you can't find it, email me. I'll send you the OKR paper.